NSW, Redditors who lived in secluded towns. What's the darkest thing that has ever happened in your town that everyone knew about but never talked about? When I was around 12, a local boy, who actually lived across the street from me, was accidentally shot by his best friend. Apparently they had took the guns out of the house when they weren't allowed to and were shooting rattlesnakes in the ditch. However, one bullet ricocheted off a tree and hit the boy point blank in the face. He hung on for about a week before they took him off life support. However, I did hear my parents say years later that it might not have been an accident, which doesn't really make sense to me because the boys were around 11 years old at the time. I know people have murdered other people at younger ages. It just seems unlikely to me that that happened. In my hometown there was a girl who hid her pregnancy from everyone. She gave birth in her family home while everyone was out but hemorrhaged and fainted. Her dad found her and took her to hospital where they proceeded to ask him where the baby was. He didn't know she was pregnant but went back to the house to find the baby. He found the baby in a bucket in the cupboard. She had stabbed it multiple times with manicure scissors. She claimed it was dead on delivery but the autopsy proved otherwise. She was arrested and spent a few months in a mental institution before being released back to my hometown. In my hometown a girl had a baby at home in the bathroom in the middle of the night. No one knew she was pregnant. She passed out, fell on the baby, suffocated the baby and she bled to death. The mother found her and the baby in the morning. A decently popular Chinese restaurant in town had one of the owner's babies walk out the back door and disappear. It was freaking heartbreaking. The parents on TV and all in the paper. There was a big search effort. Eventually they found the baby's body stuffed into one of the cabinets at the restaurant. Pretty sure the place is still open. The mother had beaten the baby to death. I looked into it, serving 22 years then being deported. The place is closed. Dang, I think I saw a news story about that or a similar story. The mom accidentally killed the daughter and told the dad to help cover it up, which he did. I live in a small town in the middle of a few small farms. One of the farms has a sort of greenhouse flower shop. One of the owner's sons committed suicide in the greenhouse. Later that year the father went into a field just outside of town and shot himself. His body was found by some kids going to school. Nobody talked about it. I'm actually from Canada in a very small town, only about 700-800 people. It's the kind of town where everyone knows everything about everyone even without people really talking about it outside of their own homes. Hence how I found out. The screenshot of Belle Plaine is interesting because I live near a town called Belle Plaine but I'm not the same one. It's crazy how many similar stories there are. If you'd like any other information I'd be happy to answer. Recently divorced father went to ex-wife's house, killed her and her new boyfriend, then shot himself, all in front of his kids. Also, another guy kidnapped a girl, killed her, violated her dead body, then chopped her up and dumped the remains. This is 2 separate people. Dude, you need to move. Most depressing story time ever. One of the biggest and most notorious cases to hit my county was when 2 teenage girls were hit and killed by a driver who fled the scene. This post reminded me of the story because one of the girls had parts of the driver's license plate imprinted on the backs of her thighs. That's how hard she was hit. The driver was drunk, went home after the crash, asked her son to hide the vehicle but first he needed to crash it into a pole to create some damage to cover up the hit and run damage. The kicker, the girl who had the license plate partially imprinted on her thighs was the daughter of the drunk driver. The driver hit her 14-year-old daughter and her best friend and left them to die in the streets. I don't think she knew who the girls were when she hit and ran, but dang, she got 8 years. Also, I live in weed country in NorCal and we have a lot of locals and non-locals who flock to our remote and rural hills to trim weed on the black market. We have an epidemic of missing and murdered women, including indigenous women, and most of those murders simply go unsolved. It's pretty terrifying. My dad getting arrested for child shaming was the giant scandal. Pretty much everyone was supportive for the most part, which I don't hear a lot of for small towns. Landlord went easy on my brother for rent until he got situated. People would periodically bring food to check on us, and it never felt like gossip reckon. I had a friend who relocated. Her dad was arrested for multiple counts of debauchery. Also a small town, but after the rest of the family relocated, we haven't spoken. I hope they are okay. A friend of mine was seeing the local pastor for marriage counseling to try and save her marriage. A few months later the pastor up and moved without notice. The whole town was abuzz with gossip. Turns out she was sleeping with the pastor, and when his wife found out he had to move to save his marriage. May we live in interesting times. So this guy's girlfriend found out that he was going back to his home country to get married. She goes into a fit of rage and ends up murdering him, loads his body into a blender, cooks up a meal and serves it to construction workers and fed the remains to neighborhood dogs. Dead guy's brother is concerned, so visits girlfriend and finds a tooth in the blender and suspects a murder, thus alerting the police. She was arrested. Today on Will It Blend? The town pastor was allegedly touching the altar children, both boys and girls. It was fricked up because apparently some of the kids told their parents about it, but the parents either didn't believe them or didn't care enough to stop this from happening. So this went on for a while and less people went to church except for the hardcore devotees, which were usually the parents of the children. So until those kids grew up they were forced to be physically shamed by their parents and no adult did anything about it, and I believe the same pastor is still there to this day. You should report this. He would 100% be still abusing other kids. Small village in England. A guy was being evicted from his home as he couldn't afford to keep up the payments. He was mentally unstable. There was a big standoff between him and the fire policemen as he was threatening to burn himself alive in the house. I think it ended in him trying to light himself on fire and failed, then someone snuck in through the back door and tackled him to the ground. Nice British ending. A bobby tackled the man in the nick of time. The mayor's daughter murdered her boyfriend and he covered it up. It was huge. I ended up moving out because it was just getting out of control. People started claiming the police chief knew about it, that the police weren't taking the matter seriously, that she had done this before. It was insane. She ended up committing suicide and blamed it all on her father in the note, and he ended up serving the sentence after taking a guilty plea. It destroyed the community. I'm not trying to say all people with bipolar disorders are murderers. How did you even get that conclusion from this? All I was saying that she murdered her boyfriend and had a bipolar disorder. The motive was that she got angry and believed he was cheating. It then dissolved into rumors after that. This whole ordeal was a shit show. The mayor went to jail for helping cover up the murder. They never established who was the actual murderer because evidence was found that implicated both of them were present at the crime scene. Out the back of my houses was a suicide hotspot. 202 confirmed suicides, including parents with children. Everybody knows somebody that has jumped, but locally it's a taboo subject. In the small town I live in northern NB, 2 small boys were strangled in their sleep by a snake. The man who owned the reptile store had an undocumented python upstairs that was about 6 feet. His kids spent the night and it had gotten out of its enclosure, which was way too small and not secured properly. I don't remember what happened to him. If you want to know more, look up Reptile Ocean Campbellton. Had to look into this, because a 6-foot python wouldn't be able to constrict and kill a child normally. I have a 5-foot ball python, just strong enough to take down a rat. It was an African rock python. They can grow to 6 meters, drastically longer than 6 feet. Also explains how it had the weight to fall through and break its enclosure. The specimen in the story weighed 45 kgs, or about 100 pounds. I'm in band. My school used to do this thing called winter percussion. It's like winter guard, but with drums. One of the male instructors physically shamed a 15-16-year-old female student. Maybe violated her IDK, but there were pieces of carpet taken for the trial throughout the back band rooms. You could go in there and still see the pieces of carpet missing, and we don't have a winter percussion anymore. I'm from Indiana. I have one. It's my neighbor town, but it's very small and just a few minutes by car from my hometown. There was a father who killed his 3 children with a hammer. It was pretty brutal for a town where nothing ever happened. Afterwards he tried to kill himself but failed. I think he was doing it out of revenge because his wife divorced him, and the kids were just there over the weekend. Also, many of my friends lived right next to this incident. We strangely never really talked about it. It died down pretty quickly and was never mentioned again. Used to live in a small town in the middle of nowhere in Western Australia. The town itself had a lot of weird things going on. but a house up the road from mine went up in flames. Turns out that house was a M lab. All the remains of the house were still there last time I went there. It was an Esperance. Just a hazard of living in WA. Never know when the neighbor's M lab is going to blow up. There was a giant monster who used to kidnap and violate children, and is now infamous internationally for his crimes. This man used to live near my town, where he abducted several children and teenage girls. He used to hide some of his victims in his cellar. During their captivity, some of the girls used pencils and sheets of paper to document their time in captivity. It is an atrocious read, because of how graphic it is presumably. Nobody speaks about him and his victims due to how horrendous the circumstances are, especially considering how he lives so close to the community. I even used to play on the same street, where he buried several of his victims. My wife grew up very near Noble GA, unincorporated, where the Tree State Crematory event came to light in 2002. The incinerator broke and the operator apparently was just tossing bodies in the backyard, kind of junkyard, in cars, under lawn clippings, partly buried, in between trees, etc. The town found out because multiple dogs brought home body parts. I used to live in that area. The crazy part is the part that was broken was only like $600 to fix to get the incinerator fixed. He was giving the family oil dry as the remains. Noble equals nasty, old, body, laying everywhere. An 18-year-old boy and a 22-year-old girl had been dating for about a year and a half. She got pregnant and decided she wanted to get married. He made himself a little scarce for a while and pretty well ghosted her, so she wrote a letter to his parents explaining the situation. A few weeks later she gets a letter from him telling her to burn all their letters and meet him at midnight and they'll elope. She does as he says, except for burning the letter telling her to meet him. Her brother went to see the boy. He says that he gave her $50 and put her on the train to the big city. Her father goes to see him at college the next month. He repeats the story about putting her on a train but says give him a few days, he'll bring her home. The boy writes a letter home saying they won't see him again, but they keep quiet about it. Several weeks later her father rushes into the local telegraph office all worked up. He's seen his daughter in a dream, badly beaten, lying face down in a shallow grave. They get a search party together, swear out a warrant for the boy's arrest on suspicion of murder, and start looking. After a couple days of searching somebody kicks aside a cloud of dirt in the woods on the boy's uncle's farm, roughly half a mile from his house, and finds the heel of the girl's boot, beaten to death, buried face down in a shallow grave, 6 months pregnant at the time of her death. She had put the letter saying they would elope in the front of her dress, along with another letter that was damaged beyond legibility. The boy was never caught. People do still talk about it. I didn't realize until a few weeks ago that the nice neighbor lady who used to give us the clothes that her sons had outgrown is the niece of the murderer, and living on the farm that he grew up on. Looking back at the old wanted posters, there's more than a passing resemblance between the murderer and her oldest son. 70 years age difference though, just a family resemblance. Holy crap, that dream. Dated a girl from a tiny mountain town. Her mom got more or less run out of their town because she had been just leaving her family for a few days at a time banging random people, and she was also linked to a couple pharmaceutical robberies in the area. Also had multiple credit cards maxed out and her kids that were all like 5-10 years old. So what's a girl to do in that situation? Move the next town over and become mayor. When I was in 4th grade, a woman in her mid-20s was murdered by her friend who apparently had a crush on her. He was in a kinda popular local metal band. He strangled her to death in his apartment, cut her head off with a machete, undressed her except for her boots and posed the headless body in a pornographic way. He took multiple pictures in different poses, as well as a few close-up pictures of her head, and uploaded them to a gore website. When the moderators contacted him he panicked, took down the post, set fire to his apartment, took her head and killed himself by driving into a truck at full speed. There was a small article about it in the local newspaper, but after a few days no one mentioned it anymore. I assume out of respect for the family. I only found out the true scope of what had happened when I became friends with the younger sister when I was in high school. Horrifically, to this day when you Google image search the deceased's name, the pictures that man posted are the very first things to turn up. They're spread across countless international gore websites, and the family can't do anything about it. A disclaimer in case anyone wants to ask for the name. I won't post it here, nor will I DM it. If that means you don't believe it, okay, but her dignity is more important than that. You're a good person. To give you some context, I'm from India, and this happened way back when I wasn't even born and was told to me by my parents. It's not really a secluded town, rather my ancestral village, which is very small with a population of around 2,000-3,000. Back in those days, dacoits were a real menace in villages of North India. They had a very distinct way of looting. They would drop a letter a day before the loot that they're coming. Be prepared. Bringing in police for help or leaving the village wouldn't have worked, as the police used to get their own commission out of the loot. Only option you had was to either surrender everything precious or die at their hands. This time, however, they chose the wrong family to mess up with. It was the richest family in the village with just too many people. Considering the threat, they planned a counterattack. When the night came and those 9-10 dacoits arrived on their horses with their guns, they found the house completely empty. As they started going through the rooms to search for any valuables, they were suddenly surrounded by a group of 80-100 people with machetes and stones and sticks and knife and anything they could find. They started beating the heck out of those 9-10 dacoits by first throwing stones at them so they dropped their weapons and then stabbing. Even the sweet old grandma was smashing heads that day. After killing all those dacoits, they buried their bodies in those vast fields. No one outside of that little village ever even heard about this event. I think that's a pretty well guarded secret. I live in a fairly secluded town. In 2006 we had a serial killer in my town that exclusively killed H. Overall he killed 5 over about a month, and what's worse is that police suspect that he didn't do this alone. But their only other suspect lead committed suicide by jumping off a bridge well known for jumpers. The guy they caught is now doing life, with the judge recommending he never be released. One of the bodies was found not even 5 minutes down the road from where I live, just off the side of the road in a small patch of woodland barely concealed by the trees. The other suspect didn't commit suicide. I've no idea where that came from, but it sounded right in my head. He was arrested twice and had even threatened 2 other prostitutes that he was going to kill them. Regular suicides. It's a small seaside town with maybe 5,000 residents. Yet every year we have people killing themselves, mostly men. One year, my son's homeroom class in primary school of 30 kids, 3 had dads who had ended their lives. A common theme is people move here, hoping for a lifestyle change. Within a year they are broke. Their pizzeria or coffee shop or whatever business idea they hoped would sustain them is failing for lack of trade. Our tourist season is very short. They picture long beach walks and hiking in the hills. Problem is, rent, mortgage and other bills don't vanish because of pretty scenery. We even have a saying here about the scenery: you can't beat it, and you can't eat it. Here in Montana we say it's a beautiful place to starve. Quintuple murder in a Lane Bryant. Man walks into the store, has 5 women tie each other up and then shoots them all in the head. There was 1 survivor, I think. They never caught the guy or even got past a generic suspect description. Prior to that we hadn't had a murder in years. No known motive. Actually fairly recent. 1-2 years I think. High school football team found out one of the members were gay. Waited until they were all in the locker room and the coach was gone and violated him with an old broomstick handle. He was kicked off the team. Dunno if he ever moved away or what happened after that. The whole thing just disappeared after a week or 2. I live in Montana. Pretty rural town up here had a crazy Mexican cartel beheading in the woods. Guy was found legs and feet tied up with barbed wire and head cut off. Body was mutilated. Pretty gnarly killing. North Idaho, town of 300-400. This guy Robert would ride around town on his 4-wheeler with his schnauzer until one day he was just gone. His buddy Greg had his dog and spent a couple of weeks trying to get it back to him, but we all assumed he had just left. A year and a half later there was a party and this dude was talking about how he had killed somebody trying to impress this lady. She doesn't buy it and shrugs him off. Dude comes back 3 hours later with a severed foot. Turns out, no joke, this is hillbilly country. Robert was shot in an alcohol and M-fueled game of cards out at their house, so they wrapped him in tarp and buried him out back. Sounds like juicy gossip, right? But these guys were friends with the police and powerful people. It was an accident and the 3 guys involved were all out under 5 years later. There's just not much to say, no reason to talk about it. Greg still takes that dog with him everywhere he goes. That last part makes me happy. I'm glad the dog has someone that loves him. Here goes. My brother and his, then, wife lived next door to a family with a teenage son. She started an affair with that son. One day, the son barged into my brother's place and started attacking him. My brother was packing ANF moving BC and he was leaving for the army. He had pulled down a metal pole in a closet to make room for boxes. My brother grabbed that pole and used it to fight off the teen. The kid ran out bleeding. My brother called my dad. We lived a few blocks down the street, and my dad jumped into action. He grabbed one of his hunting shotguns and some bird ammo. He ran out the door to the car screaming for us to call 911. My mom and I ran after him. BC, we were clueless and wanted to see where he was headed. My mom was on the phone with the cop and they were dispatching the one cop that we had in our town. We start running down the road to my brother's place. BC, we saw dad pull in. As we get near, we hear a gunshot and see my dad and brother taking cover behind the car doors they'd opened to climb in and leave. Another shot goes off and we can see it isn't my dad firing. The teen had run home next door and was bleeding and told his dad my brother was trying to kill him. His dad grabbed his handgun and saw my dad and brother leaving and started shooting. That's the gunfire mom and I heard. Dumbass kept running towards my dad's car. I saw my dad position his shotgun in the car window and fire one round. Then, he and my brother climbed in the car and started driving back at us home. We all finally get together and dad says he shot the man in the stomach. Chaos breaks out on our street. Ambulance, cops, and people. They take the other dad away to the hospital and my dad into custody. Within hours, we find out that the man has died. The bird shot hit his liver and he bled out. My dad was charged with murder and we started receiving death threats. In the cover of night, we are moved. We hid for days until my dad was bonded out. Ended up moving far away. Grand jury was convened and I had to testify to what I saw. After all the evidence and testimony were presented, my father wasn't charged. BC, the grand jury decided it was self-defense. I still have contact with some friends from that town. BC, of social media. We never talk about what happened or anything. Things carry on as normal. That day is forever burned into my memory. When I was in high school, my former Sunday school teacher hung himself. His daughters, who were 10 and 7, found his body when they got off the school bus. He was also a volunteer firefighter, so they dedicated a bench in his honor. What people don't talk about is his suicide note confession. He had been molesting those 2 little girls. His widow did not attend the funeral. Everyone keeps pretending it's a tragedy, and it is for those girls, but I'm glad he's dead. It's horrible that the true victims are not even considered. My town isn't really secluded per se, but it is tiny and scummy. My dad became friends with a drunk and kleptomaniac who was actually surprisingly good at heart through his job. He lost touch with him when he changed employers, but the guy stuck around the area and eventually and coincidentally ended up working contracting in that town with an uncle of mine. Well, one day he was moving a ladder near some power lines and another guy helped him. The ladder hit the line and electrocuted my dad's old buddy. From what I heard, right after it happened, he sat bolt upright, calmly said either, "Wow, hope that don't kill me," or "Frick, that just killed me." Here's the fricked part. The guy wasn't bad at his job, and he didn't need help moving that ladder. He'd done it a dozen times to the 5th power. He can handle it. The guy that helped him, he was low-key banging the victim's wife, and continued to do so afterwards. Everyone thinks he was pushed, and no one ever spoke up or had it investigated because it was this dark as heck moment where you just didn't talk. Guys, electricity can make your body move after you've been fricked. That's why he sat up. As for speaking, let me clarify, he wasn't killed instantly. 98% of his brain was, roughly. He was a vegetable for months and then his family pulled the plug because the doctor said it was extremely unlikely he'd ever live. Truly, again, my guess is the combination of impulses from the massive shock made him sit, and whatever was left of his mind just said what it was feeling and went lights out. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.